They sent her to a lonely mountain ranch expecting her to disappear. But why did the cowboy who wanted no one near him suddenly refuse to let her leave? Snow whipped across the porch as Clara Bellamy stood frozen beside her small trunk, facing the silent cowboy who had lived alone for years. The cabin door creaked open. His gray eyes studied her, and her worn gloves tightened around the handle. She had been sent away by everyone who knew her, but what happened inside that mountain cabin was something nobody expected. Stay with us and discover the story. The last thing Clara Bellamy heard before the wagon left Granite Hollow was her Uncle Henry closing the front door behind her. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. For 32 years, Clara had learned that the quiet things often hurt the most. She stood beside the old wooden wagon with her small trunk resting near her boots, watching the frost settle over the fence posts around the Bellamy farm. The morning air smelled of frozen dirt, chimney smoke, and the bitter cold that came down from the mountains every winter. Henry Bellamy stood on the porch with his coat buttoned tight, one hand resting on the railing. "You understand this is only for the winter," he said. Clara looked back at him. "I understand. You'll work for the Calloway place. Cook, clean, help where you can. Ethan Calloway needs someone willing to stay up there." The way he said it made the words feel heavier than they should have. Not someone he wanted, someone he could send away. Clara lowered her eyes and adjusted the wool shawl around her shoulders. The wind caught a loose strand of her brown hair and pushed it across her face. She tucked it behind her ear. "I know what the arrangement is, Uncle Henry." Henry shifted uncomfortably. For a moment, he looked like he might say something kinder, but the moment passed. "You know how things are here," he finally said. "The farm has been struggling. Your room, your meals, everything costs something." Clara looked toward the barn, the same barn where she had spent countless mornings feeding chickens before sunrise, the same fields where she had worked beside her uncle when his back started giving him trouble. The same house where she had spent years making herself useful. She almost smiled. "Almost. I never asked for anything I didn't earn." Henry's jaw tightened. I didn't mean it that way, but they both knew he had. Clara lifted her trunk into the wagon. It took effort. She had never been ashamed of that. Her hands were strong from years of carrying supplies, hauling water, and tending animals. They were not delicate hands. They were not the kind people admired at town dances. They were hands that knew how to keep things alive. A few neighbors had gathered near the road, not close enough to pretend they were there by accident. Clara heard the whispers. "That's her, the one going up to Calloway Ridge. I heard that man hasn't had company in years. Well, she won't have much competition." A few quiet laughs followed. Clara kept her eyes forward. She had heard those kinds of words her entire life. Sometimes they came from strangers. Sometimes they came from people who shared her family name. Rose Bellamy stood farther back near the general store road, holding a basket against her coat. Clara's younger sister looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to step forward but didn't know how. Rose had always been the one people noticed first. She had the kind of beauty that made strangers remember her after a single meeting. Men opened doors for her. Women invited her into conversations. People listened when she spoke. Clara loved her sister, but sometimes love did not erase the distance between two people living different lives. Rose finally walked closer. Clara turned. For a second, neither sister spoke. "I wish things were different," Rose whispered. Clara gave a small nod. "I know." Rose looked toward the mountain road. "Are you afraid?" Clara glanced at the distant peaks covered in white. The mountains looked endless, cold, unforgiving. She thought about the cabin waiting somewhere beyond those ridges. She thought about Ethan Calloway, a man she had never met except through stories. The stories were never kind. The mountain ghost, the man who lived alone, the cowboy who never came into town unless he had to. "No," Clara said. It was not entirely true, but it was the answer she needed Rose noticed. You don't have to pretend with me. Clara looked down at her gloves. I've been pretending for years. The words were quiet. Rose had no answer. The wagon driver cleared his throat. They needed to leave. Clara climbed into the wagon and took her seat beside the driver. Her trunk was tied down behind them with rope. Inside were a few dresses, a sewing kit, a small book of household remedies, and the only photograph she had of her parents. Not much, but enough. As the wagon rolled away from Granite Hollow, Clara did not look back right away. She watched the road ahead. The wooden buildings of town grew smaller behind her. The general store, the church, the rows of homes where people knew her name but never truly knew her. The farther she traveled, the quieter it became. Soon there were only open fields, tall pines, and the sound of wagon wheels grinding over frozen ground. The driver, an older man named Samuel Reed, kept his eyes on the trail. He worked for Ethan Calloway and had been sent down to bring Clara up the mountain. After nearly an hour of silence, he finally spoke. Cold season comes early up there. Clara nodded. I expected that. The road gets rough. I expected that too. Samuel glanced at her. Most people he transported to Calloway Ridge asked endless questions. How big was the ranch? How much money did Ethan have? What kind of man was he? Clara asked none of those things. After another mile, Samuel said, You know what folks say about Ethan? Clara looked toward him. I've heard enough about what folks say about me. Samuel looked away. A small breath escaped him, almost a laugh. Fair point. The wagon continued upward. By late afternoon, the mountains surrounded them. The road narrowed between dark pine trees. Snow covered the ground in uneven patches, untouched except for animal tracks and the wagon trail. The world felt enormous, and Clara felt very small, but she sat straight. She had survived too many years of being underestimated to let a mountain frighten her. Near sunset, they finally saw smoke rising above the trees. A cabin stood on a slope overlooking the valley. It was not grand. It was not welcoming. It was simply strong, built from thick logs with a stone chimney and a small barn nearby. Calloway Ridge Ranch. Samuel climbed down and tied the horses. He's inside. Clara stepped onto their frozen ground. Her boots sank slightly into the snow. For a moment, she stood there with her trunk beside her. The cabin door opened. Ethan Calloway appeared. He was taller than she expected. Broad shoulders, dark coat, a face marked by years outdoors. His gray eyes moved from Samuel to Clara, then to the trunk beside her. He had expected someone older, perhaps someone who looked like a temporary worker. Instead, he found a woman standing alone in the snow, holding herself with more dignity than most people he knew. Samuel cleared his throat. Ethan, this is Clara Bellamy. Ethan nodded once. Miss Bellamy. Mr. Calloway. Silence settled between them. The wind moved through the trees. Ethan looked toward the wagon. You're aware this is a difficult place to live. Clara looked past him at the cabin. I assumed it was. Winter up here isn't like winter in town. I assumed that too. His eyes returned to hers. Most people would have tried to impress him. Most people would have apologized for needing the work. Clara did neither. Ethan seemed almost unsure what to do with that. I don't need anyone feeling sorry for them, he said. Clara's expression did not change. Good. A slight pause. Because I didn't come here for that. The words surprised him. She stepped toward her trunk. I came here because there was work that needed doing. Ethan watched as she lifted one side of the trunk. After a moment, he stepped forward and took the other side. Neither of them spoke. Together they carried it inside. The cabin was warm but plain. A table, 2 chairs, a stove, a fireplace. Everything was clean. Everything was practical. And everything felt like it belonged to one person. Clara noticed the second chair at the table. unused. A layer of dust sat on it. She noticed the empty space beside the fireplace, the silence inside the walls. Ethan placed the trunk near the corner. "Your room is through there." Clara followed his gesture, a small room separated from the main cabin. "It isn't much. I didn't expect much." Again, Ethan looked at her. She said things differently than other people, not bitter, not desperate, simply honest. Outside, Samuel prepared to leave before darkness fully covered the mountain. Clara stood near the window watching the wagon disappear down the trail. Behind her, Ethan poured coffee into a tin cup. "You'll have questions." She turned, eventually. I nodded. "Most people do." Clara looked around the cabin, at the quiet, at the mountains outside, at the man who had chosen to disappear from the world. "I have one." Ethan waited. "Why did you agree to this?" For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not sadness, something older, something he quickly hid. "I needed help." Clara accepted the answer, even though she knew it was not the whole truth. That night, as snow began falling over Granite Hollow, Clara Bellamy unpacked her few belongings in a room that did not belong to her. Not yet. Down the hall, Ethan Calloway sat alone beside the fire, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person moving through his cabin. He had spent years protecting his silence. Now a woman everyone else had rejected had stepped into it, and neither of them knew that the mountain they feared would become the place where both their lives began to change. Morning came quietly to Calloway Ridge Ranch. There was no church bell, no wagon wheels passing on the road, no voices from neighbors calling across fences. Only the sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the soft creak of the cabin settling as the temperature dropped outside. Clara Bellamy woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar wooden walls above her, the folded blanket at the foot of the narrow bed, and the small window covered with frost. She sat up slowly. The room was colder than the one she had left behind in Granite Hollow, but somehow it felt easier to breathe. Nobody here knew her history. Nobody here had watched her grow up and decided what she was worth. She dressed quickly in a dark wool skirt, a plain blouse, and a thick sweater she had repaired twice herself. She pinned her hair back, pulled on her boots, and stepped into the main room. Ethan Calloway was already awake. He stood near the stove, pouring coffee into a metal cup. He looked exactly like he had the night before, quiet, reserved, like a man who had learned not to expect conversation. "Morning," Clara said. Ethan glanced over. Morning was all. Clara almost smiled. At least she knew where she stood. She walked toward the kitchen area and opened the cabinet doors carefully. There was flour, a small amount of coffee, some dried beans, salt, not much else. She looked over her shoulder. "How long since you've been into town?" Ethan lifted his cup. "Few weeks." "Few weeks?" He shrugged. "Didn't need much." Clara looked back at the empty shelves. She did not argue, not yet. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves. The cabin had been clean, but clean was not the same as cared for. There were small things, a loose hinge, a cracked wooden spoon, a window frame that let cold air through. Things a person living alone might stop noticing. Ethan watched her from the table. "You don't have to start working the moment you arrive." Clara turned. "I know, then why are you?" She looked at the broken latch on the cabinet door. "Because it needs fixing." Something about the answer made Ethan quiet. It was not a complaint, not a request for praise, just a simple fact. By mid-morning, Clara had already organized the kitchen supplies, cleaned the stovepipe, and repaired the loose cabinet hinge with a small toolkit she carried in her trunk. Ethan came inside after checking the horses. He stopped near the doorway. The cabin looked almost the same, but not quite. The shelves were arranged differently. A small cloth covered the table. The coffee pot sat closer to the stove. Nothing dramatic, nothing expensive, just signs that someone had been there. Ethan looked at the table. "You brought that cloth?" Clara nodded. "It was in my trunk. You needed it?" She looked at him. "No," a pause. "I wanted it." Ethan had no answer for that. He turned away and hung his coat. Outside, the ranch waited. Clara followed him later that morning, not because he invited her, because she wanted to understand the place she would spend the winter. Callaway Ridge Ranch stretched across the mountain valley. It was beautiful in a harsh way. Tall grass bent under frost. Wooden fences disappeared into the white landscape. The barn stood against the mountain like it had been there forever, but Clara noticed the problems immediately. One gate hung crooked. Several fence posts leaned. The cattle looked thinner than they should. A black and white calf stood apart from the herd, breathing slowly near the edge of the pasture. Ethan noticed where her eyes went. "Don't worry about the calf," Clara looked at him. "Why? It's been weeks since birth. Has anyone checked it?" Ethan looked slightly offended. "I know my animals. I didn't say you didn't." The answer caught him off guard. Clara walked closer to the calf, slowly, carefully. She did not force anything. The animal watched her approach, but did not move away. Clara crouched and examined the calf's condition. Ethan stood a few feet behind her, watching. "You always do that?" he asked. "Do what? Look at things before deciding they're broken." Clara looked up. "I suppose," she stood, "the calf needs warmth and better feed." Ethan crossed his arms. "You think that's all? I think it's a start." He looked toward the animal, then back at her. For a moment, Clara expected him to dismiss her. Instead, he said, "Samuel said you knew about animals." Clara nodded. "My father kept a small farm before he died. And after? After that, I kept things going." The answer was simple. But Ethan noticed the way she said it, like she had been carrying that responsibility for a long time. Later that afternoon, Clara helped Ethan repair the fence near the northern field. He handed her tools without explaining. She knew how to use them. That seemed to surprise him. "You've done this before." Clara tightened a wire. "Many times. Most women in town wouldn't know which end of a hammer to hold." She looked at him. "Most men in town wouldn't know how to keep a house running for 10 years either." For a second, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then the expression disappeared. But Clara saw it, and so did he. The moment passed quickly. Near sunset, Samuel Reed returned from checking the lower pasture. The older ranch hand climbed down from his horse and looked toward the cabin. "You settled in all right, Miss Bellamy?" "I did." Samuel glanced at Ethan, then back at Clara. "Didn't expect anyone to last more than a week up here." Clara smiled faintly. "I wasn't planning on disappointing you." Samuel chuckled. Ethan looked away. It was the first sound of laughter the cabin had heard in some time. That evening, Clara prepared supper. Nothing fancy. Beans, fresh bread from the supplies she brought. Coffee. But when Ethan sat at the table, he paused. The room looked different, not because of the food, because someone had taken the time to make the place feel lived in. Ethan picked up his fork. "This is good." It was not much. A simple sentence. But Clara looked up. She had received compliments before, usually about her cooking, usually followed by someone asking her to make something else. This was different. Ethan said it like he had simply noticed something true. "Thank you," she said. They ate quietly. Not an uncomfortable silence. Not exactly. Just two people learning the shape of a new routine. After supper, Clara washed the dishes. Ethan stood near the fireplace. His eyes moved toward the far corner of the room. There was an old saddle hanging on the wall, worn leather, carefully preserved. Clara noticed him looking at it. She said nothing. Neither did he. A photograph sat on a small shelf nearby, partly hidden behind a book. Ethan reached for it, then stopped, his hand lowered. Clara looked away, giving him privacy. After a moment, he walked outside, the door closed behind him. Clara stood alone in that cabin. She did not know what had happened in his past, but she knew one thing. A person did not build walls that high without a reason. Outside, Ethan stood beneath the cold evening sky. The mountains surrounded him, they always had. For years, that had been enough. But now, through the cabin window, he could see a warm glow where there had only been darkness before. He watched Clara move quietly inside, a woman the town had dismissed, a woman they believed had nowhere else to go. Yet somehow, in a single day, she had made his empty cabin feel less empty. Ethan looked away. He told himself it was temporary. Winter would end, the arrangement would end. Everything would return to the way it was. But deep down, he knew something had already shifted, and he was not sure whether he wanted to stop it. For the next several days, Ethan Calloway tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. The ranch still needed work, the cattle still needed feeding, the fences still needed mending. The mountains still woke before the sun and fell silent after dark. Everything was supposed to remain the same, except it did not. There was now a lamp burning in the kitchen before dawn. There was the quiet sound of someone humming while preparing breakfast. There was a second coffee cup sitting beside his own. Small things, things Ethan told himself meant nothing, but he noticed every one of them. Clara Bellamy settled into the rhythm of Calloway Ridge faster than he expected. She did not ask permission for every little thing. She also did not assume anything belonged to her. She simply worked. Every morning, she checked the supplies, fed the chickens, and walked through the barn to see which animals needed attention. She learned where Ethan kept his tools. She learned which floorboard near the kitchen door creaked. She learned that Ethan liked his coffee strong and took it without sugar. She learned that he rarely spoke before sunrise, and Ethan learned things about her too. He learned Clara repaired her own clothes instead of buying new ones. He learned she saved every receipt from town because she believed a person should always know where their money went. He learned she kept dried herbs hanging near the window because her mother had taught her that every household needed something useful growing or waiting nearby. He learned that she laughed quietly when she thought nobody was listening. He never mentioned that last one. One morning, while Ethan was fixing a broken wagon wheel outside the barn, Clara walked over carrying a small basket. "You skipped breakfast." Ethan looked up from the wheel. "I wasn't hungry." She held out the basket. "You weren't hungry yesterday either." He stared at her. Clara did not look away. After a moment, Ethan accepted the basket. Inside was bread, cheese, and an apple. "You keep track of everyone?" "No." She paused. "Only the people who forget to take care of themselves." Something about that answer stayed with him longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, Samuel Reed rode in from the southern pasture. The older cowboy removed his gloves and looked toward the cabin. "Never thought I'd see the day." Ethan continued tightening the saddle strap. "See what? Someone besides you making that place look like a home." Ethan gave him a warning look. Samuel raised both hands. "Didn't say it was a bad thing." "No, just surprising." Ethan had no reply, because it was. The following week, supplies began running low. The ranch needed flour, lamp oil, medicine for the animals, and a few replacement tools. The nearest supply stop was Granite Hollow. Ethan avoided the town whenever possible, but there were things even he could not get around. "We'll leave after breakfast," he told Clara. She looked up. "To town?" He nodded. "You need anything?" Clara thought for a moment. A spool of blue thread. Ethan looked at her. "That's all, and coffee." A small pause. "Good coffee." For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Almost a smile. That I can understand. Ride into Granite Hollow took nearly 2 hours. The road was frozen and uneven, with wagon tracks hardened into the dirt. Clara sat beside Ethan in the wagon. She kept her hands folded in her lap, watching the mountains slowly disappear behind them. "You don't like town," she said. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "No, why?" He was quiet for a while, then, "Too many people." Clara glanced at him. "You live on a mountain." "Exactly." She looked away, hiding a small smile. When they reached Granite Hollow, people noticed immediately. The town had not seen Ethan Calloway arrive with another person beside him in years. The wagons stopped near the general store. Conversations slowed, heads turned. Clara felt it before she saw it, the same looks she had known all her life. Judging, measuring, deciding. She stepped down from the wagon carefully. Ethan noticed. "You all right?" She nodded. "I'm fine." But he saw her hand tighten slightly around the edge of her coat. Inside the general store, Clara helped choose supplies while Ethan spoke with the owner. She picked up a bag of flour and checked the price. The shopkeeper gave her a receipt and smiled politely. Then the door opened. Walter Grayson walked in. He was a man who always looked like he belonged wherever he stood. Clean coat, expensive boots, a gold watch chain visible beneath his vest. Walter owned several cattle contracts in the area and had a reputation for knowing everything that happened in Granite Hollow before anyone else. His eyes moved from Ethan to Clara, then he smiled. Not warmly. "Well," Walter said. The room became quieter. "Looks like the mountain ghost finally brought someone down from his hill." Ethan did not answer. Clara continued looking at the supplies. Walter stepped closer. "I suppose congratulations are in order." His gaze moved toward Clara. "Though I admit I didn't expect this." The shopkeeper looked uncomfortable. "Ethan, you need those fence tools I set aside?" Ethan ignored him. Walter continued. "Must be peaceful up there. No neighbors, no expectations." Clara slowly turned. Walter smiled. "Some folks are lucky. They don't have to worry about fitting into society." The words sounded polite, but everyone in the room understood. Ethan placed the money on the counter. "Come on, Clara." Walter laughed softly. "Don't be so sensitive, Calloway. I was only making conversation." Ethan turned. For years, people in Granite Hollow had seen Ethan as quiet, distant, unreachable. But the look in his eyes now was different. Then find someone else to talk to. The room went still. Walter's smile faded slightly. "You taking offense for her now?" Ethan stepped closer, not threatening, not angry, just certain. "I'm telling you to show respect." Walter glanced toward Clara. She doesn't seem bothered. Clara opened her mouth, but Ethan spoke first. "That's because she's stronger than most people in this room." Nobody moved. Walter looked almost surprised. Ethan continued. "Doesn't mean you get to test that strength." Clara stared at him, not because he defended her, because he did it without making her feel weak. He did not speak for her. He stood beside her. There was a difference. Walter adjusted his coat. "Careful, Calloway. Towns remember things." Ethan picked up the bag of supplies. "So do I." Walter walked out. The store remained quiet. A few minutes later, Ethan and Clara stepped back onto the street. The wind moved through town. People watched. But this time, Clara noticed something different. Not everyone looked away. Some people looked uncertain, as if they were seeing her for the first time. They loaded the supplies into the wagon. For a while, neither spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." Ethan looked toward the road. "Yes, I did." She studied him. "Why?" He was silent. The wagon horses shifted. A church bell rang somewhere in town. Finally, Ethan answered. "Because he was wrong, that was all. No speech, no grand explanation, just the truth." On the ride back to Callaway Ridge, Clara watched the mountains ahead, the same mountains that had frightened her when she arrived, the same mountains that now felt slightly less lonely. She looked at Ethan. He kept his eyes on the trail, but when the road became rough, his hand moved without thinking, steadying the wagon before it could shake too hard. A small gesture, almost invisible, but Clara noticed, and Ethan noticed that she noticed. Neither said anything. They did not need to, because somewhere between the frozen roads and the quiet mountain mornings, something had begun that neither of them knew how to name. And when Granite Hollow watched them ride away together, the town learned one thing. Ethan Callaway was no longer standing alone, but on the mountain, where the wind carried no gossip and the roads disappeared beneath snow, Ethan and Clara returned to a different kind of silence. Not the empty silence Ethan had known for years, something else, something unfamiliar. The kind of silence that existed between two people who were slowly learning each other's habits. Winter settled over Granite Hollow with little warning. The first heavy snowfall came 3 days after their trip into town. By morning, the trail leading down the mountain was buried beneath several inches of snow. The fence lines disappeared under white drifts, and the pine branches bent low under the weight. Ethan stood outside the barn, pulling his gloves tighter. "We won't be going anywhere for a while." Clara stepped beside him, holding a basket of laundry. "How long? Depends on the weather." She looked toward the mountain road. "And if it takes weeks?" Ethan glanced at her. "Then it takes weeks." It was a simple answer, but Clara understood. For Ethan Callaway, being cut off from the world was not a problem. It was what he was used to. For her, it was something new. Still, she did not complain. She simply turned back toward the cabin. "Then we should make sure we have enough supplies." Ethan watched her walk away. That was something he was beginning to notice. Clara did not spend time worrying about things she could not change. She prepared for what came next. The next several days became a routine. A quiet one. Clara baked bread when the flour allowed it. She repaired old curtains near the kitchen window. She sorted the medicine bottles in the cabinet and labeled them carefully so Ethan would know what was running low. Ethan spent his mornings checking cattle, clearing snow from the barn, and chopping wood. But now, when he came inside, there was usually a warm meal waiting, a lamp burning, a chair pulled near the stove. He never asked for these things. Clara never asked if he appreciated them. Somehow, they simply became part of the days. One evening, Ethan came inside carrying an armful of firewood. The room was warmer than usual. Clara sat at the table sewing a torn sleeve. The sound of the needle moving through fabric filled the cabin. Ethan set the wood down. "You missed a spot." Clara looked up. "Where?" He pointed toward the sleeve. A small section of loose thread remained. She looked at it, then laughed softly. "After all that, you noticed one thread?" Ethan removed his coat. "I noticed things." The words came out before he thought about them. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she lowered her eyes back to the sewing. "So do I." Neither explained what they meant. They did not have to. Outside, snow continued falling against the window. Inside, the fire burned steady. A week passed, then another. The mountain kept them there. And slowly, the cabin began changing. Not because Clara brought expensive things. She did not have those. She brought small things. A clean cloth over the table, a jar of dried herbs near the stove. Freshly washed blankets folded neatly, a little vase with pine branches she collected during one of her walks. Ethan noticed every change. He just never commented, until one afternoon. Clara was standing on a chair trying to reach a shelf when Ethan walked in. He stopped immediately. "What are you doing?" She looked down, moving the dishes. "You're standing on a chair," I noticed. "That chair is missing a leg." Clara looked down. The chair shifted slightly. She froze. Ethan crossed the room quickly and steadied it. For a moment, they stood close, not touching, just aware. Clara stepped down carefully. "Thank you." Ethan nodded. "You could have fallen, but I didn't." No, but I pause. Because I walked in, there was something in the way he said it. Not pride, not arrogance. Just a quiet fact. Clara looked away first. Later that evening, Ethan repaired the chair. He replaced the weak leg and tested it twice before putting it back near the table. Clara noticed. She did not mention it. But the next morning, she poured his coffee before he asked. Small things. That was how they spoke. Not with promises, not with declarations, with actions. Then one night, Clara woke to the sound of footsteps. She sat up. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of dying embers. She stepped quietly into the main room. Ethan was sitting beside the fireplace. He was holding something. An old wool coat. A woman's coat. Clara stopped. She almost turned away, but Ethan spoke first. Her name was Margaret. His voice was low. Clara stayed near the doorway. She did not move closer. She did not ask questions. She simply listened. She hated the cold. A faint smile crossed his face. Always said she was born in the wrong place. The fire popped softly. Ethan looked down at the coat in his hands. She wanted to leave the mountains. Clara remained silent. She said there was a whole world outside these ridges. His fingers tightened slightly around the fabric. But I thought this place was enough. The room became still. Then one winter changed everything. Clara looked at him. For the first time since she arrived, she saw beyond the quiet man who fixed fences and checked cattle. She saw the person underneath, the person who had lost something he could never replace. Ethan noticed her standing there. He immediately began folding the coat. "I'm sorry." Clara shook her head. "For what?" He looked uncomfortable. "I don't usually talk about this. You don't have to apologize for remembering someone." His eyes lifted. Their gaze met. For a moment, neither looked away. Then Ethan placed the coat back where it belonged. "She would have liked you." The words surprised both of them. Ethan looked toward the fire. She liked people who could take care of themselves. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. Not because of the compliment, because she understood what he was really saying. He was not comparing her. He was trusting her with a part of himself he kept hidden. The next morning, Ethan found something beside his coffee cup. A small piece of paper. It was a simple note. "Feed the gray mare extra oats. She looks tired. Nothing else. No signature." He looked toward the barn. The gray mare was one of his oldest horses. He had not mentioned she was struggling. Clara had noticed anyway. Ethan folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. That afternoon, he found himself repairing the barn door longer than necessary, not because it needed it, because he was thinking about a woman who arrived with one trunk, a woman everyone in Granite Hollow had decided was unwanted, a woman who somehow saw broken things and tried to fix them. Even him. That evening, the storm grew stronger. Snow pressed against the windows. The cabin creaked beneath the wind, but for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway did not hear the mountain as an empty place. He heard another person breathing, another person moving through the rooms, another person waiting by the fire. And that frightened him more than any storm ever had. Because storms eventually passed. But letting someone matter again was something else entirely. By the time winter reached its deepest point, Calloway Ridge Ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Almost. The mountain was still unforgiving. The mornings were still cold enough to freeze water left too long in a bucket. The roads were still buried beneath snow and ice. The nearest town was still hours away, but the cabin no longer felt like a place where one man waited out the years. There were signs of life everywhere. A basket of folded blankets near the fireplace, a small stack of books beside the window, a jar of dried herbs hanging from a wooden peg. And every morning, before Ethan left for the barn, there was a fresh cup of coffee waiting beside his gloves. He never asked Clara to do these things. She never asked him to notice. That was how they had found their peace, until the cattle started losing weight. Ethan noticed it before anyone else. He always did. The ranch was not just land and animals to him. It was something he understood, the way some men understood music. A change in the herd, a different sound in the barn, a fence post leaning slightly farther than it should. Small things spoke, and that morning, the cattle were telling him something was wrong. He stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the herd move slowly through the snow-covered field. Samuel Reed rode up beside him, not looking good. Ethan kept his eyes forward. No. The feed shipment from Grayson came late again. Ethan looked over. Again? Samuel nodded. 2 weeks behind schedule. Ethan's jaw tightened. The supply routes around Granite Hollow were controlled by a handful of merchants. Walter Grayson was one of them. For years, Ethan had avoided dealing with him whenever possible. But avoiding a problem did not make it disappear. By afternoon, Ethan was in the office beside the barn. The small room had always been his place for numbers and decisions. Ledgers sat stacked on the desk. Old receipts were pinned beside notes about cattle purchases, feed orders, and repairs. Clara walked past the open door and stopped. She saw the papers spread across the desk. She saw the way Ethan sat there without moving. Something wrong? Ethan looked up. The ranch is losing money. Clara stepped inside. How much? He hesitated. Most people would have avoided the question. Clara did not. Enough that I may have to sell part of the land before spring. The words hung in the room. Clara looked at the papers. Can I see? Ethan leaned back. You don't need to worry about this. She looked at him, not offended, just steady. I wasn't asking because I was worried. A pause. I was asking because I might be able to help. Ethan studied her. Weeks ago, he might have dismissed the idea, but things were different now. He moved the ledger across the desk. Go ahead. It was a small thing, but Clara noticed. He trusted her enough to let her see what he usually carried alone. She spent the next hour reading through the records. She did not rush. She looked at dates, amounts, names, delivery notes. Ethan watched from the corner of the room while pretending to organize tools. Finally, Clara stopped. This doesn't make sense. Ethan looked over. What? She pointed to one of the receipts. Your feed prices increased 3 times in 4 months. That's because winter supplies cost more. Some increase, yes. She moved to another page, but not this much. Ethan walked closer. Clara traced the numbers with her finger, and here, she pointed again. Your cattle medicine order was charged twice. Ethan frowned. I checked those invoices. Did you check them against the delivery records? He was quiet. Clara looked up. I know you are used to handling things yourself. She lowered the paper. But sometimes people who carry everything alone don't have anyone standing beside them to notice what they miss. The words were not meant to hurt, but they reached somewhere deeper than she realized. Ethan looked away. After a moment, he picked up the papers. Where did you learn this? Clara shrugged. Running a farm with very little money teaches you to count every coin. She gave a small smile. My uncle used to say I worried too much about receipts. Ethan looked back at the ledger. Maybe you were paying attention. That evening, they continued working. The cabin stayed quiet, except for the sound of pages turning and the fire burning low. Clara compared records. Ethan checked old supply notes. Together, they began finding a pattern, the same company, the same inflated charges, the same missing deliveries. Walter Grayson. The next morning, Ethan rode to town. Clara expected him to leave alone. Instead, he stopped beside the barn. You coming? She looked up. To town? He nodded. I think you should see this for yourself. The words surprised her, not because he invited her, because he wanted her there. Granite Hollow looked different when they arrived this time. People still noticed them, but fewer people laughed. Some simply watched. The general store owner greeted Clara by name. The woman who ran the small diner offered her a seat near the window. Small changes, the kind that happened quietly. Walter Grayson was waiting outside the supply office. As always, he looked perfectly prepared. His coat was clean. His boots had no mud. His smile was calm. Ethan, Walter. The two men stood facing each other. Clara remained beside Ethan. Walter noticed. Still bringing help with you? Ethan's expression did not change. She's not help. Walter raised an eyebrow. Then what is she? Ethan looked at Clara, just for a moment, then back at Walter. Someone who sees things you missed. Walter's smile faded. Clara opened the folder she carried. Inside were copies of receipts, delivery records, and purchase orders. She placed them on the table outside the office. I compared your invoices with the ranch records. A few townspeople nearby began listening. Walter glanced down, then back up. You've been going through my business? No. Clara's voice stayed calm. I've been going through Ethan's. She tapped the papers, and these numbers don't match. The crowd grew quieter. Walter looked at Ethan. You let her do this? Ethan answered immediately. I asked her to. That response seemed to surprise everyone, even Clara. Walter picked up one of the papers. You don't understand how business works. Clara looked at him. Maybe not the way you do. A pause. But I understand when a person is being charged for something they never received. For the first time, Walter had no quick answer. The wind moved through the street. A horse tied near the hitching post shifted nervously. Ethan watched Walter carefully. He knew this was not over. Men like Walter did not lose quietly, but standing there beside Clara, with the town watching, Ethan realized something. For years, he had protected his ranch by staying away from people. Now the person who came into his life unwanted was the one helping him fight to keep it. And Clara Bellamy, the woman everyone believed had nothing to offer, had just uncovered the truth that could save everything he had built. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway found himself standing in the middle of Granite Hollow with something to lose. Not just land, not just cattle, something more difficult to protect. A person. The ride back to Calloway Ridge that evening was quieter than usual. The mountains stretched across the horizon, painted orange by the setting sun. The wagon wheels moved slowly over the frozen road, leaving two deep tracks behind them. Clara held the folder of documents against her coat. Ethan kept his hands on the reins. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Clara looked over. You regret bringing me? Ethan turned slightly. What? To town. She looked down at the papers. Everything was easier when you handled things alone. Ethan watched the road ahead. Easier isn't always better. The answer was simple, but Clara noticed the weight behind it. She looked out toward the mountains. People in town are going to talk. They already were, about you. Ethan's expression remained calm. Let them. Clara studied him. A few months ago, that answer would have sounded impossible from the man who avoided Granite Hollow whenever he could. Now he was willing to stand there, beside her. The next morning, Ethan rode back into town alone. He wanted to speak with the supply office before rumors grew larger than the truth. But when he'd reached the main street, he realized the rumors had already started. People stood outside the diner. Two ranchers spoke quietly near the feed store. The moment Ethan stepped down from his horse, conversation slowed. Walter Grayson was inside the office, as expected. He sat behind the desk with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. Ethan. Walter looked up. Come to apologize? Ethan removed his gloves. No. Walter leaned back. Then why are you here? To discuss the missing deliveries. Walter smiled. You mean your wife's accusations? Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Careful. Walter noticed the warning. But he continued. She spends a few days looking through papers and suddenly thinks she understands cattle business. Ethan said nothing. That bothered Walter more than an argument would have, because Ethan Calloway had never been a man who needed many words. Walter folded his hands. You know what your problem is, Ethan? No, you think being stubborn makes you strong. A pause. But sometimes a man needs to accept when something is already gone. Ethan looked around the office, at the shelves, the records, the contracts, then back at Walter. You should hope that's true. Walter's smile disappeared. What does that mean? It means if I find out you took advantage of isolated ranchers, you'll answer for it. Walter stood. For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence. Then Walter laughed, not because he found it funny, because he wanted Ethan to believe he did. You really think this town will stand with you? Ethan picked up his gloves. I don't need the whole town. He paused. I need the truth. Then he walked out. By afternoon, more ranchers had come forward. Samuel Reed helped collect old invoices from other properties. Several men discovered their accounts had the same strange charges Clara found in Ethan's records. The pattern was impossible to ignore, but Walter was not finished. That evening he showed up at Calloway Ridge Ranch. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains. Clara was inside the cabin preparing supper when she heard the sound of another horse approaching. Ethan stepped outside first. Walter sat on his horse near the gate. He did not dismount. I came to talk. Ethan stayed near the porch, then talk. Walter looked past him toward the cabin, toward Clara standing near the doorway. She has you fighting battles that aren't yours. Clara stiffened. Ethan noticed. Walter continued. You were better off before she arrived. The words hung in the cold air. For a second, Ethan said nothing. Then he walked down from the porch, not quickly, not angrily, just enough that Walter understood. Don't speak about her like that. Walter raised an eyebrow. Why? Ethan looked back toward the cabin. Clara was watching, quiet, still, but he could see the uncertainty in her face, a look he had seen before, a look from someone used to being the person people blamed. Ethan turned back. Because she has done more for this ranch in a few months than most people have done in years. Walter laughed softly. You're defending her now? Ethan answered without hesitation. Yes. The single word carried farther than any speech could have. Walter looked at him, then at Clara, the woman Granite Hollow had laughed at, the woman they expected Ethan to hide. But he didn't. Walter pulled the reins. This isn't over. Ethan nodded. I know. Walter rode away. For several minutes, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Clara remained by the doorway. Ethan walked back toward the cabin. You didn't have to say that. He stopped. Yes, I did. She looked at him. Why? Ethan looked uncomfortable. Not because he did not know, because he did. Because it was true. The answer left her quiet. Inside, Clara returned to the stove, but her hands moved slower. Something had changed. Not in the way the town saw her, something deeper. Ethan had not defended her because she had helped the ranch. He had not defended her because he needed her skills. He had defended her because somewhere along the way, she had become someone worth standing beside. Later that night, Samuel sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. He looked around the cabin. Never thought I'd see this place with a second chair actually being used. Ethan glanced at him. Samuel smiled. Don't look at me like that. I'm just saying. Clara poured more coffee. Samuel accepted the cup. You know, Miss Bellamy, I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. For what? When you arrived, I thought you wouldn't last. Clara smiled faintly. A lot of people thought that. Samuel nodded. Turns out a lot of people were wrong. The words were simple, but they meant something. After Samuel left, Clara stood by the window. The mountain was quiet, the same mountain that had felt endless when she first arrived. Now it looked different. Not smaller, just less empty. Ethan came beside her. For a moment, they watched the snow-covered valley together. You should know something, Clara said. What? People don't change their minds quickly. Ethan looked toward her. I know, they may respect what I did for the ranch, but that doesn't mean they respect me. A long silence followed. Then Ethan said, maybe. Clara looked at him. He continued, but you don't need everyone to. She waited. You just need the right people. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Then Ethan stepped back first, not because he wanted distance, because he understood her. And that understanding mattered more than either of them could admit. Outside, the wind moved across Callaway Ridge. The fight with Walter Grayson had only begun, but something else had already happened. The woman who arrived believing she had nowhere else to go had become the one person Ethan Callaway refused to let anyone push aside. And Granite Hollow was beginning to see what Ethan had already learned. Clara Bellamy was not a burden. She was the reason the mountain finally felt like home. But even after the town began to see her differently, Clara still carried the same doubts she had brought with her in that small trunk months before. Respect was not the same as belonging. Kind words were not the same as love, and being needed was not the same as being chosen. Spring slowly arrived at Granite Hollow. The snow around Callaway Ridge melted first near the southern fields, revealing patches of dark earth beneath the white. The creek that had been frozen for months began moving again, carrying small pieces of ice downstream. The mountains changed with the season, so did the ranch. The cattle grew stronger, the fences were repaired. The supply problems had slowed after several ranchers began comparing their records and refusing Walter Grayson's unfair contracts. But the biggest change happened inside the cabin. Ethan no longer left before sunrise without saying anything. Some mornings, Clara found him waiting by the door with his coat already on. Coming to check the northern field, it was not an order, it was an invitation. At first, Clara thought she imagined it. Then it happened again and again. They began spending more time together outside the ranch, not in grand moments, in ordinary ones, the kind that mattered more. Ethan showed her a hidden trail above the eastern ridge where wildflowers grew after the snow disappeared. Clara taught him how to preserve vegetables longer through the summer months. He repaired the loose step outside the cabin before she could mention it. She replaced the torn lining inside his old coat without telling him. He noticed anyway. You fixed this. Clara looked up from the table. It needed fixing. Ethan ran his fingers over the repaired seam. You could have asked me. I know. A small pause. I wanted to do it. The answer stayed with him because it sounded familiar. It was the same way he felt when he repaired the chair she almost fell from. Some things were not done because someone asked. They were done because someone mattered. One afternoon, Ethan returned from checking the upper pasture and found Clara sitting on the porch with the ranch records. The sunlight rested across her hair. A gentle breeze moved the pages on her lap. You working? She looked up, trying to organize the supply records. You don't have to. I know. Ethan almost smiled. She had a habit of answering him that way, a quiet reminder that she chose what she did, not because she was told, because she wanted to. He sat beside her, not too close, but closer than he would have months earlier. For a while they looked over the valley. The land stretched beneath them, the same land Ethan once thought he would leave behind without regret. I used to think this place was enough, he said. Clara turned slightly. Ethan kept looking forward. The ranch, the mountains, the quiet. A pause now. He was silent. Long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. Now I'm not sure. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. Clara looked down at the papers. She wanted to believe there was more behind them. She wanted to ask, but something stopped her, because hope had always been dangerous for her. Hope made people expect things. Hope made disappointment hurt more. That evening, Ethan prepared supper while Clara finished the last of the records. When she walked into the kitchen, she stopped. The table was set, 2 plates, 2 cups, and beside her chair was a small bundle of blue thread, the same shade she had asked for during their first trip to town. She looked at it, then at Ethan. You remembered. Ethan shrugged. You needed it. A smile touched her face. You remembered. He looked away. I remember things. Clara held the thread carefully. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but to her it meant more than expensive gifts ever could. Because someone had noticed. Someone had listened. Later that night, after the dishes were washed, Ethan stood near the doorway. There was hesitation in him. Clara noticed she had learned his silences, the ones that meant he was thinking, the ones that meant he was fighting against words he was not used to saying. Clara. She looked up. Yes? He stepped closer. Not much, just enough. I've been thinking about something. Her hands rested on the edge of the table. What? Ethan looked toward the window. The valley was dark. Only the lantern light reflected against the glass. I don't want this arrangement to be temporary anymore. Clara became still. The words she had secretly waited for were finally near. But instead of relief, she felt fear, because the next words mattered, and because she knew how easily dreams could disappear. Ethan turned back toward her. I want you to stay. The room went quiet. Clara looked at him. For a moment, she saw the man who had stood beside her in town, the man who trusted her with his ranch, the man who had slowly opened doors he kept locked for years. But then another voice returned, the voices from Granite Hollow, the ones saying she was lucky anyone wanted her, the ones reminding her that people valued what she could provide, not who she was. You mean because of the ranch? Ethan frowned slightly. What? Clara looked down. You need someone here. No, I help with the records, the animals, the house. Her voice became quieter. Maybe you just don't want to lose what I do. Ethan stared at her, Clara. But she stepped back, not because she wanted distance, because she was afraid. You've been kind to me. A pause. But kindness and love are different things. The words hurt more than she expected. And they hurt Ethan too, because for the first time he understood something. The mountain was not the only wall between them. Clara had built one too, a wall made from years of believing she could never truly be chosen. Ethan wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he did not look at her and see what she could do, that he saw the person who walked into his empty cabin and somehow made him want tomorrow, but the words would not come. Not yet. He had spent years learning how to survive. He had never learned how to ask someone to stay, so he only said, "That's not what this is." Clara looked at him. Then what is it? The question remained between them. Ethan had faced storms, hard winters, broken fences, difficult men. But this was different because the answer required him to admit something he had avoided for years, that he was no longer afraid of being alone. He was afraid of losing her. Outside, the wind moved softly across Callaway Ridge. Inside, 2 people stood in the same room, both wanting the same thing. and both afraid to believe it was possible. For several days after that conversation, Callaway Ridge Ranch became quieter. Not empty, not cold, but quieter. Clara still prepared meals. Ethan still checked the fences before sunrise. They still worked beside each other. But something had changed. Before, their silence had felt comfortable. Now it carried questions. Ethan noticed it first. Clara no longer sat on the porch when he repaired tools outside. She no longer stayed near the barn when he returned from checking the cattle. She was still kind, still helpful, but there was a careful distance in everything she did. A distance she thought he could not see. One morning, Ethan found her packing supplies into a wooden crate. He stopped near the doorway. "What are you doing?" Clara looked up, organizing things. He glanced at the folded blankets and the small collection of jars she had stored near the kitchen. "Looks like more than organizing." She looked away. "I just like knowing where things are." Ethan stood there for a moment. He knew that answer. It was the same kind of answer he gave when he was avoiding something. "Clara." She paused, but she did not turn around. "I heard you." His voice softened. "I know." The room became still. Then Clara finally looked at him. "I don't want to make things difficult for you." "You don't. I came here because I had nowhere else to go." Ethan's expression changed. "You think that's what I see?" Clara lowered her eyes. "I think sometimes people need something, Ethan." She folded a piece of cloth carefully, and when they need it, they convince themselves it's more than it is. Those words stayed with him because he knew she was not talking about him. Not completely. She was talking about every person who had ever made her feel useful but never valued. Before Ethan could answer, a sound came from outside, a wagon. Both of them turned. A few minutes later, a familiar figure stepped down from the wagon. Rose Bellamy. Clara froze. Her younger sister stood near the gate, holding a small travel bag and wearing a dark green coat covered with dust from the road. Ethan noticed Clara's reaction. Not surprise, not happiness, something more complicated. Rose walked closer. "Clara." Clara stepped outside. "What are you doing here?" Rose looked toward the cabin, then at Ethan. "I needed to speak with you." Ethan understood immediately. He nodded toward the barn. "I'll give you both some space." He walked away before either woman could object. Rose watched him go. Then she looked back at her sister. "He really cares about you." Clara's face tightened. "Rose, I mean it. Don't." Rose sighed. The two sisters stood beneath the cold afternoon sky. For a moment, neither knew where to begin. Finally, Rose said, "I found something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. Clara looked at it. "What is that?" "Something I should have shown you a long time ago." The paper was old. The edges were worn. Clara unfolded it slowly. As she read, the color in her face changed. It was a land document, a legal agreement. Her name was written across the top. Her hands became still. "Where did you get this?" Rose swallowed. "From Uncle Henry's desk." Clara looked up. "Why would he have this?" Rose looked ashamed, because he knew. The wind moved through the trees. Clara read the document again. She did not understand at first, then she did. Years earlier, after her parents died, the small portion of land and savings they left behind had been placed under family management. Henry had told Clara there was nothing left, that everything had been used for farm expenses, but the document showed something different. Her inheritance had been transferred, not spent, transferred. Clara looked at her sister. "He knew?" Rose nodded. "He said it was practical." A bitter smile crossed Rose's face. "He said you would never need it." Clara looked down at the paper. "Why?" Rose hesitated. because he believed you would never marry. The words landed harder than Clara expected, not because they surprised her, because some part of her had always feared they were true. Rose stepped closer. "Clara, I was wrong." Clara folded the document. "About what?" "About letting people decide who you were." The younger woman's voice shook. "I thought because people admired me, I understood how the world worked." She looked toward the mountains. "I didn't realize how cruel it was until I watched what they did to you." Clara said nothing. For years, she had carried the belief that something about her made people overlook her. Her size, her quiet nature, the way she never demanded attention. But now she was seeing something different. Maybe the problem had never been that she was not enough. Maybe people had simply decided not to look closely. That evening, Ethan found Clara sitting alone near the edge of the pasture. The sun was low behind the mountains. He approached slowly. "Rose leaving?" Clara nodded. She went back before dark. He sat beside her, not too close. The same careful distance they had both been keeping. After a while, Clara handed him the document. Ethan read it. His expression hardened. "Henry did this?" Clara nodded. "I didn't know. No." She looked toward the valley. "Nobody wanted me to know." Ethan folded the paper carefully. "We should go to town." Clara looked at him. "Why? Because he needs to answer for this." She shook her head. "No." Ethan frowned. "No?" Clara looked at him. "I spent my whole life waiting for someone to fight my battles." A pause. "I don't want that anymore." The words surprised him, not because they were angry, because they were strong. "I want to handle this myself." Ethan studied her, then slowly nodded. "All right." Clara looked at him. "You agree?" "Yes." Another pause. "Because it's your choice." Something in her expression softened. That mattered, more than she expected. Ethan had protected her in town. He had stood beside her when Walter tried to shame her, but now he understood something important. Standing beside someone did not mean taking control of their life. Sometimes it meant trusting them enough to let them stand on their own. That night, Clara placed the document inside her trunk. Not hidden, not forgotten, just kept safely. The next morning, Ethan found her preparing to ride into Granite Hollow. "You're going alone?" She nodded. "I need to." He looked at her for a moment, then handed her a pair of gloves. "These are warmer." Clara looked down. "They're yours. I know. You'll need them. I have another pair." She held them carefully, a small gesture, a quiet one, but it said what neither of them was ready to say. "Be careful. Come back. I care." As Clara rode away from Callaway Ridge, Ethan stood by the gate watching. Months earlier, he would have felt relief at having his solitude returned. Now the sight of an empty road felt different. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Callaway understood something that frightened him. A person could become part of a place, and a place could become empty without them. Ethan Callaway learned that lesson slowly, not in one moment, not with some grand realization beneath the mountain sky. It happened in small ways: the second coffee cup beside the stove, the sound of Clara's footsteps crossing the wooden floor in the morning, the little notes she left near the kitchen shelf reminding him which supplies were running low, the quiet way she opened the curtains each day and let sunlight into rooms that had stayed dark for years. He noticed all of it, especially after it was gone. Clara returned from Granite Hollow 2 days later. She came back with the document safely stored inside her trunk. She did not talk much about Henry Bellamy. She did not complain. She did not ask Ethan to ride with her or stand beside her. She handled the matter herself, and Ethan respected her for it. But something between them remained unfinished. The words from that night still lived in the cabin. "I want you to stay." "You mean because of the ranch?" Ethan had replayed that conversation more times than he wanted to admit. He knew what he meant, but knowing something inside yourself and saying it aloud were two different things, especially for a man who had spent years believing silence was safer. Spring continued to move across the valley. The last patches of snow disappeared from the fields. The creek near the eastern fence ran clear again. The ranch needed attention everywhere. There were gates to repair, calves to watch, supplies to order before summer. Life continued, but Clara had started making plans. Ethan noticed it one morning when he found a list beside the kitchen table. Clothing, travel supplies, a few household items. He looked at it longer than he should have. When Clara entered carrying a basket of clean towels, she saw him. "You weren't supposed to read that." Ethan set the paper down. "Are you leaving?" She became still. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara placed the basket on the table. "I think I should." The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. "Why?" She looked toward the window. "Because winter is over. That doesn't answer my question." Clara folded her hands together, the same way she did whenever she was trying to stay calm. "Ethan, I came here because I needed work," a pause, "and because your ranch needed help." He looked at her. "That isn't all you were. I know you believe that." The words were gentle, not accusing. That made them worse. Ethan stepped closer. "I do believe it." Clara looked at him. "Then why haven't you said it?" He stopped. The question was simple, but it reached deeper than any argument could. Because the truth was, Ethan had spent years preparing himself to lose things, his wife, his brother, his old life. He knew how to survive grief. He knew how to build walls. But he did not know how to stand in front of someone and say, "I need you." Clara looked away first. "I understand, Ethan." "No, you don't." She looked back. His voice was quieter now. "You think this is about the ranch, isn't it?" "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. But then Ethan hesitated, and that hesitation told Clara everything. Not because it proved she was right, because it showed how difficult it was for him to explain. She gave a small, sad smile. "That's what I thought." Ethan wanted to stop her. He wanted to tell her that she had changed the way he looked at mornings, that the cabin no longer felt like a place where he waited for life to end, that he had started imagining years ahead instead of only surviving one season at a time. But the words stayed trapped. Clara turned away. "I should finish packing." That afternoon, she went through the cabin carefully, not like someone leaving in anger, like someone returning a place to the way she found it. The extra dishes were wrapped and placed back in her trunk. The herbs near the window were taken down. The small cloth covering the table was folded neatly. Ethan watched from the doorway. "You don't have to remove everything." Clara looked over. "It was mine." A pause. "But I know it was your home first." The sentence stayed with him, because that was exactly what she believed. That she had only been visiting, that she had never truly belonged. The next morning, Clara prepared to leave. Samuel Reed arrived with a spare horse and wagon. He understood immediately. Older men often understood things without asking. He removed his hat when he saw Clara. "Leaving, Miss Bellamy?" She nodded. For a while, Samuel looked toward Ethan, then back at her. He wanted to say something, but he didn't. Some goodbyes needed their own silence. Ethan carried Clara's trunk to the wagon. Neither spoke. When he placed it down, his hand rested on the handle for a moment longer than necessary. Clara noticed. So did he. "You were good to me," she said. Ethan looked at her. "You were good to this place." She smiled faintly. "That's not what I meant." He knew. The mountain wind moved between them. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came. Clara waited. Just for a second. Then she understood. She nodded. "Take care of yourself." He looked at her. "You too." Two simple sentences. Not enough, but all they had. Clara climbed onto the wagon. As Samuel turned the horses toward the road, Ethan stood near the gate. He watched until the wagon became smaller, then smaller still, until it disappeared beyond the trees. The cabin was quiet when he returned. Too quiet. He stepped inside. The table was empty. The second chair sat untouched. The kitchen smelled faintly of the herbs Clara had packed away. Everything looked exactly as it had before, but it no longer felt the same. That evening, Ethan poured coffee into a single cup. He stood there for several seconds. Then he reached for another, stopped, and slowly put it back. The days that followed were harder than he expected. He returned to old habits, early mornings, long rides, quiet meals, no questions, no conversation. The life he once wanted had returned, and somehow it felt smaller. One evening, Samuel found him repairing a fence post that did not need repairing. The older ranch hand leaned against the fence. "You know, Ethan kept working." "What? You were alone before she came?" A pause. "Yes." Samuel looked towards the mountains. "But you weren't lonely until she left." Ethan stopped. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Then he lowered the hammer. Samuel walked away without saying anything else. He did not need to. That night, Ethan sat beside the fireplace, the same place where he had once held Margaret's old coat, the same place where Clara had found him. But now there was no storm outside, no reason to feel trapped. Only the quiet realization that the thing he feared most was not losing someone. It was losing someone, and pretending he was better off without them. And for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway admitted something he could no longer ignore. The mountain had never been the thing keeping him company. Clara had. Ethan Calloway understood that now. But understanding something and knowing what to do with it were two different things. For weeks after Clara left, he continued living the way he always had. He woke before sunrise, he fed the horses, he checked the fences, he counted cattle, he repaired whatever needed repairing. From the outside, nothing had changed. That was what most people would have seen. But Samuel Reed saw differently. The older ranch hand noticed the things Ethan no longer did. He no longer sat on the porch after supper. He no longer drank coffee slowly while watching the valley. He no longer spoke about the future. Before Clara arrived, Ethan had lived like tomorrow was simply another day to endure. After she left, he lived like tomorrow was something he was waiting to survive. One afternoon, Samuel found Ethan inside the cabin moving furniture. "Rearranging now?" Ethan looked up. Floorboard was loose. Samuel glanced down. "That board has been loose for years." Ethan looked back at the floor. "Never bothered me before." Samuel almost smiled. Almost. Then he walked away. Some things were better discovered alone. Ethan removed the old wooden board near the corner of the room. Beneath it was a small space where dust had collected over time. At first, he saw nothing. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper pushed beneath the boards. He picked it up. The paper was worn. The edges were bent. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Clara. For a moment, he simply stood there. He almost put it back. Almost convinced himself it was not his place to read something she had not given him. But then he saw his name, Ethan, only once, at the top. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. The words were not many. Clara had never been someone who wasted words, but every sentence carried the weight of things she had never said. She wrote about Granite Hollow, about how she had spent years believing people only noticed what she could do, not who she was. She wrote about arriving at Calloway Ridge, expecting nothing. No kindness, no friendship, no future. Then she wrote about him, about the small things, the way he fixed the broken chair without saying anything, the way he remembered her blue thread, the way he stood beside her in town without making her feel helpless. At the bottom of the page was one sentence that made Ethan stop. I think I found a place where I belonged. I just don't think I was meant to stay. Ethan read it again, then again. The room was silent, the fire burned low, and for the first time he understood. Clara had not left because she did not care. She left because she cared too much to stay where she believed she was only needed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Ethan folded the letter carefully, then he placed it inside his coat. That same evening, Walter Grayson returned to Granite Hollow. The town had not forgotten the accusations against him. Some ranchers had stopped doing business with him. Some questioned his records, but Walter was not a man who walked away easily. He entered the supply office carrying a leather folder. Inside were contracts, old agreements, documents meant to prove that he still controlled the trade routes around the valley. A few ranchers gathered nearby. Samuel was among them. Walter looked around. You all seem to have forgotten who kept this town supplied before people started listening to a woman with a stack of papers. Nobody answered. Then Samuel stepped forward. Funny thing about records? Walter looked at him. What? Paper remembers better than people do. The words drew quiet agreement from those nearby. Walter's expression hardened. He turned away, but he was not finished. That night, Ethan sat at his desk reviewing the old ranch documents again. The letter from Clara rested beside him. For the first time, he was not looking at numbers. He was looking at choices, his and hers. He thought about the first day she arrived, standing in the snow, holding that small trunk, refusing pity. He thought about how easily he could have missed her, how close he had come to seeing her as another temporary arrangement. The truth bothered him, because Clara had spent her whole life believing people overlooked her, and he had almost done the same thing. Not because he thought she lacked value, because he was afraid of admitting how much she had gained. The next morning, Ethan saddled his horse. Samuel watched from the barn. You going somewhere? Ethan tightened the saddle strap. Yes, Samuel waited. Ethan looked toward the trail leading away from the ranch. I'm going to find her. Humwell nodded. No surprise, no questions, only about time. Ethan looked at him. The older cowboy shrugged. You've spent years chasing cattle through storms. He adjusted his hat. Seems fair you ride after something that actually matters. Before Ethan could leave, a rider appeared on the ridge, a young man from the settlement near the southern valley. He carried a message. Ethan Calloway? Duh. The man handed him a folded paper. From Granite Hollow. Ethan opened it. The town clerk had sent word. Walter Grayson had filed a claim against several ranchers, including Ethan. He was trying to regain control before anyone could challenge his business. Ethan read the note. For a moment, two roads stood in front of him. One toward town, one toward Clara. A year ago, he would have chosen the fight, the ranch, the land, the thing he had spent his whole life protecting. But now he understood something. A ranch could be rebuilt. A business could be recovered. But some people only came into your life once. He folded the paper. Samuel. The older man looked over. Handle the cattle until I return. Samuel nodded. And Walter? Ethan mounted his horse. I'll deal with him. The horse turned toward the trail. But first, I need to bring someone home. The ride ahead would not be easy. The mountain paths were still rough. The spring rains had damaged parts of the trail. The settlement where Clara had gone was several days away. But Ethan had faced longer roads, colder nights, harder seasons. This time he was not riding away from something. He was riding toward it. Toward the woman who had walked into his lonely cabin and changed everything without ever asking for anything in return. And for the first time in years, Ethan Calloway was no longer trying to protect himself from losing someone. He was willing to risk everything to make sure he did not. The road south was long, longer than Ethan remembered. The mountains that had always been his shelter now felt like they were standing between him and the one person who had made them feel like home. He rode through cold mornings and quiet valleys, following the trail toward the small settlement where Clara had gone. Every mile gave him more time to think about what he should say, about what he should have said, about all the moments when Clara had been waiting for him to speak, and he had chosen silence instead. Ethan Calloway had spent most of his life believing silence kept people safe. It kept questions away. It kept pain away. It kept memories from becoming too heavy. But now he understood something. Silence did not protect him from losing people. Sometimes it was the reason he lost them. After several days on the trail, Ethan reached a small valley settlement near the southern pass. It was not much. A few wooden buildings, a small church, a general store with a faded sign above the door, a blacksmith shop where smoke rose into the cold air. He stopped near the store and asked about Clara Bellamy. The storekeeper looked at him carefully. "You're Ethan Calloway?" Ethan nodded. The man wiped his hands on his apron. "She mentioned you." Those words made Ethan pause. "What did she say?" The storekeeper thought for a moment. "Not much." A small smile appeared. That seemed to be her way. Ethan almost smiled. It was true. Clara never filled silence just because it existed. "Where is she?" The man pointed toward a small farmhouse beyond the creek, helping the widow who owns that place. "Keeping records for her, I think." Ethan thanked him, then he rode on. The farmhouse sat at the edge of the valley. Smoke rose from the chimney. A small garden rested beside the porch. For a moment, Ethan stayed on his horse. He had faced storms. He had faced men who wanted his land. He had faced years of loneliness. But standing there, looking at the house where Clara had built a life without him, he felt something far more difficult. Fear. Not fear that she would reject him. Fear that she had finally found peace without him. He tied the horse near the fence and walked toward the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. Clara stood there. For several seconds, neither spoke. She looked different, not changed completely, just more settled, more certain. The same woman who arrived at his cabin carrying one trunk now stood there as someone who had chosen her own path. Ethan. Voice was quiet. Clara. The wind moved between them, then she looked past him. Did something happen at the ranch? He shook his head. No. That surprised her. Then why are you here? Ethan had imagined this moment many times. He had imagined speeches, perfect words. But standing in front of her, he realized something. Clara never needed perfection. She needed honesty. I came because I was wrong. Her expression changed slightly. Ethan continued. I thought if I gave you a place to stay, food, and work, that was enough. Clara looked away. Ethan. No, voice was gentle. Let me finish. She became still. I thought I was protecting myself by keeping things simple. He glanced down at his hand. The truth is, I was afraid. Clara looked back at him. Afraid of what? He met her eyes. Of needing someone again. The answer stayed there. No excuses, no defenses, just the truth. Ethan stepped closer. When you came to my ranch, everyone thought they knew who you were. Clara's eyes lowered. They were wrong. A pause. But I was wrong too. She looked at him. You never saw me as a burden. No, his voice became firmer. I saw someone who walked into a place I had abandoned and made it worth living in again. Clara looked away quickly. The emotion on her face was something she tried to hide. Ethan continued. You fixed fences. You saved my cattle. You helped me fight a man who thought he could take everything from me. He took a breath. But those aren't the reasons I came. The silence stretched. I came because the house was quiet without you. Clara closed her eyes briefly. The words reached deeper than she expected. because they were not about what she did, they were about who she was. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I know." That answer surprised her. He did not argue. He did not tell her she was wrong. He simply accepted the truth. People spent years making you believe you had to earn a place. He looked at her. "You don't." A tear formed in her eye, but she quickly looked away, not from sadness, from the unfamiliar feeling of finally hearing something she had needed for years. Before she could answer, a rider approached from the road. It was Samuel. He had followed after receiving a message from Granite Hollow. "Ethan." Ethan turned. Samuel climbed down from his horse. Walter made his move. Clara looked between them. "What happened?" Samuel removed his hat. "The town meeting is tomorrow. Walter is trying to convince everyone the records were mistaken." Ethan looked toward the mountains. For a moment, Clara saw the old Ethan, the man who carried every burden himself. Then he looked back at her, and something was different. He was not choosing between the ranch and her. He was choosing a future that included both. "We go back tomorrow." Clara hesitated. "You don't have to do this for me." Ethan looked at her. "I know." A small pause. "I'm doing it with you." Those words mattered, because Clara finally understood. He was not rescuing her. He was not saving her. He was standing beside her. The next morning, they rode north together. The journey back to Callaway Ridge was quiet, but it was not the same silence as before. Clara rode beside Ethan, not behind him, not following. Beside him. When they stopped near a stream to rest the horses, Ethan handed her the reins while he gathered water. A simple gesture, a sign of trust. When the sun began to set, the mountains appeared again in the distance. The same peaks, the same valley, the same road where Clara had first arrived feeling like she had been sent away. But this time, she was returning, not as a worker, not as someone who needed a place, as someone who had been chosen. And Ethan Callaway was returning too, not as the man who lived alone on the mountain, but as a man finally willing to build a life with someone else. The fight with Walter Grayson was waiting. The town would have its questions. The future would still have challenges. But for the first time, Ethan and Clara faced them together. And that changed everything. The road back to Granite Hollow felt different, not because the mountains had changed, not because the trail was easier. The same cold wind moved through the valleys. The same wooden fences stood along the fields. The same peaks watched over the land. But Ethan Callaway was no longer riding alone, and Clara Bellamy was no longer returning as the woman who had been sent away. She was returning as someone who had chosen where she belonged. The town meeting was held in the small building beside the general store. Nearly every rancher in Granite Hollow had gathered. Men who had spent years trusting Walter Grayson's word now sat with folded arms, looking through the documents Clara and Ethan had collected. Walter stood near the front. His confidence remained, but it was not the same as before. Too many people had questions now. Ethan and Clara entered together. The room became quiet. Months earlier, the same town had watched Clara leave with whispers behind her. Now people moved aside to let her pass, she noticed. But she did not look for approval. That was the difference. Walter noticed too. "You brought her back." His voice carried across the room. Ethan looked at him. Walter smiled faintly, still letting her speak for you. Clara looked at Walter before Ethan could answer. "No." The room went quiet. She stepped forward. "I speak because I have something to say." Her voice was calm, not loud, not angry, just steady. She placed the documents on the table. The problem was never one missing receipt. She opened the folder. It was a pattern. She explained each record carefully. The supply charges, the repeated mistakes, the missing deliveries, the same numbers appearing in different ranch accounts. Several ranchers looked through their own papers. One man near the back shook his head. I thought I was the only one. Another nodded. So did I. Walter looked around the room. He realized something. The people he had counted on staying quiet were no longer silent. He turned toward Ethan. You think this changes everything? Ethan looked at him. No, a pause. The truth does. The room remained still, because everyone understood. This was no longer about the woman from the mountain ranch. It was about every person who had trusted the wrong man. By the end of the meeting, Walter no longer had control over the town's supply contracts. The ranchers would review new agreements together. No single person would decide their future again. Outside, the evening air was cool. The sky above Granite Hollow turned gold as the sun dropped behind the mountains. Clara stood near the steps of the meeting hall. For a while, she simply watched people leave. Ethan came to stand beside her. You all right? She nodded. Yes. A pause. Just strange. What is? She looked back toward the town. Being seen, Ethan understood. He did not tell her she was wrong. He knew some things could not be fixed with a few kind words. They had to be lived. I meant what I said before. She looked at him. About what? About you not needing everyone to understand you. The wind moved between them. You never did. Clara looked down. For years, she had tried to prove herself, to show people she was useful, capable, worth keeping around. But standing there beside Ethan, she finally understood something. She had spent so much time trying to convince others she deserved a place. She had forgotten she deserved one without permission. The next morning, they returned to Callaway Ridge. The ranch looked the same, the barn, the fences, the long valley stretching toward the mountains. But Clara noticed something. There was no longer a feeling that she was entering someone else's world. Ethan noticed too, because when they reached the cabin, Clara walked inside without hesitation. She placed her bag beside the door, not like a visitor, like she belonged. Months passed, then years. Callaway Ridge changed slowly. The ranch grew stronger, the fields became healthier, the cattle herds expanded. But the biggest changes were inside the home. The cabin gained new shelves, new curtains, more books, a larger table, and eventually a second chair that was no longer empty. People from Granite Hollow began visiting the ranch for more than business. They came for advice, for conversation, for the feeling of a place where people were welcomed. Samuel Reed remained at the ranch, often pretending he was not pleased with the changes, but everyone knew better. One summer afternoon, Rose Bellamy arrived at Callaway Ridge. She stepped onto the porch and looked around. The same mountain, the same ranch, a completely different life. Clara hugged her sister, not because the past disappeared, but because they had both learned from it. Later, Rose sat with Clara outside while Ethan checked the northern fence line. I used to think I was the lucky one, Rose said quietly. Clara looked at her. Rose smiled sadly. Everyone looked at me first. A pause. But you were always the stronger one. Clara shook her head. No. Rose smiled. Yes. She looked toward Ethan in the distance. People finally see what I saw too late. Clara followed her gaze. What? That you never needed someone to save you? Rose smiled. You only needed someone who knew how to stand beside you. Years later, when people told the story of Callaway Ridge Ranch, they often remembered the same thing. They remembered the lonely cowboy who lived above the valley, the man who believed he needed no one. They remembered the woman who arrived carrying one trunk and a lifetime of disappointment. They remembered how people laughed when she left Granite Hollow, how they assumed she was being sent somewhere she would never belong. But they were wrong. Because the mountain did not break Clara Bellamy, it revealed her, and Ethan Callaway did not rescue her. He recognized her. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, Ethan and Clara stood together on the porch. The valley below was quiet. The ranch was peaceful. The same mountains that once surrounded Ethan's loneliness now surrounded a home. Ethan looked toward her. "Still think you don't belong here?" Clara smiled. "No." A small pause. "I think I finally stopped asking." He reached for her hand. Not because she needed someone to hold it, because he wanted to, and after all the years of silence, loss, and uncertainty, Ethan Calloway finally understood the truth. A person could spend a lifetime building walls around their heart, but sometimes the right person did not break those walls down. They simply waited outside until you were ready to open the door. Clara Bellamy was never too much. She was never a burden. She was never someone who needed to become smaller to be loved. She had simply been waiting for the one person who would look at her and see exactly what she had always been: enough. And maybe that is what makes Clara Bellamy's journey stay with us long after the mountain winds fade, because somewhere in our own lives, many of us have stood where Clara stood, carrying doubts that were placed on our shoulders by others, wondering if we had to prove our worth before someone could truly choose us. Imagine walking into a place where nobody knows your story, where you have nothing to offer except the person you are. Would you have the courage to believe that you were already worthy of love, respect, and a second chance? Clara found that the deepest healing did not come from changing who she was. It came from finally being seen. Ethan discovered that protecting your heart forever can also mean keeping love away. Sometimes the greatest strength is not standing alone, but trusting someone enough to stand beside you. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what moment stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories of love, healing, courage, and unexpected second chances, we invite you to subscribe. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you in the stories ahead.